students, welcome to Legacy IAS Academy. In today's video, we are going to discuss about the second part of desert landforms, and we are going to discuss about depositional landforms that develop in the arid or the semi-arid region due to the action of water as well as wind. So let us start and try to understand how these depositional landforms develop in the desert areas. So as we know, due to the movement of the wind or sometimes ephemeral water sources, materials are eroded from some part of the desert regions and then transported in the desert, and they cannot move beyond the desert boundary because by the time they reach the outermost or outer skirt of the desert boundary, they lose most of their energy, and that is why they must come to rest somewhere in the desert region. And thus, as mainly wind-borne materials, they shift according to their coarseness, they shift according to their size. It can be expected that the larger size particles or coarser sand particles will be too heavy to be blown out of desert limits, and that is why within the desert area they remain as dunes or other kind of depositional landforms that we are going to discuss in next few slides. So the first and the most important, or we can say the depositional landform that cover a large expanse of deserts all across the world, is something that we can refer as dunes, also called as sand dunes. In simple term, if you have to define sand dunes, we can define it as an accumulation of the sand particles in a hill-like structure or hill-like form, which is mainly made up of loose wind-borne sand. Now, the dune can be active as well as inactive. When we refer to active dunes, we mean that such dunes which are continuously in movement, continuously in motion due to the blowing of the winds. On the other hand, inactive dunes refer to such kind of dunes which are kind of fixed at their place due to presence of such kind of frictional barriers, such as due to presence of vegetation, or we can understand that some kind of hilly kind of structure can be there, platform like a structure can be there that might be preventing the movement of sands any further. Thus, we can divide the dunes into two types, active and inactive. Third, also what geologists have come to understand, that what will be the nature of these dunes, how higher will be these dunes, what will the movement or speed of movement of these dunes, and all these things are determined by three major factors. The one is the amount of sand that is being carried by the wind. Second is the density of vegetation that is present in a desert area through which the sand dunes are moving or the winds are blowing through. And third is the speed of wind itself. So the sand, vegetation, wind, these are the three major parameters that basically characterize different types of dunes. Also, what we have to understand, in last video we have discussed about three major types of desert. We have Arid desert, Rig desert, and Hamada desert. So the dunes are characteristic feature of the Arid. And basically Arid is Arabic word which means sea of sand. So obviously the sand dunes will develop in the Arid desert, and it is characteristic feature of deserts like Sahara Desert, Thar Desert in India, as well as the Mojave Desert in California. Also, if we have to understand that how depositional work is happening in the desert areas, we have discussed also that three major types of movements are there through which sand particles or rock fragments move in the desert areas. These are called as suspension, when the materials are being moved or blown away by the wind when they are suspended in the atmosphere because they're very minute in size. Second is saltation, where they are thrown at a certain distance gradually by the movement of wind, especially the wind becomes very stronger. That is when we have saltation. And third is surface creep, when the material is being dragged away at the surface, on the surface, because of their larger size. And as a result of this suspension, saltation, and surface creep, we have both erosion as well as depositional landform development in the desert region. Now, since the most important landform is the dunes, as we have discussed right now, so dunes can also be characterized into several different categories. And one of the most important type of dune that we have to discuss today are called as birchen dune. The picture of birchen dunes you can clearly see on the diagram here. This is the actual photograph of birchen dune, and this is to explain you that how birchen dunes form. But if I simply ask you that what can or how can you define the shape of birchen dune, you'll obviously say that it is a crescent shape of dune, for example, because it has this crescent kind of shape. So birchen dune generally develops in those areas where the movement of the wind is transfers to the location or orientation of the sand dune. As you can see from here, this is the orientation of birchen dune, and the air or wind is flowing transverse or perpendicular to this birchen dune. And due to this reason, what happens? We have maximum frictional force that is exerted here, and that is why the dune do not advance so much at this particular point because of high frictional forces. But as you move in the sideward area, the frictional forces are relatively lesser, and thus two horns like a structure seems to be radiating out from this main part of dune that gives it a kind of horn-like appearance, or we can say crescent-like appearance. Next point also we can understand that if we talk about birch and dunes, they generally develop because of the chance occurrences. What is the chance occurrences? Chance occurrences is, suppose that simple dune is moving in the desert area and then suddenly it comes to stop due to presence of some sort of resistance barrier. This can be in the form of natural vegetation most of the time, and thus it prevents the further movement of the sand particles in this area, but sand particles keep on moving in the sideward areas, giving it a crescent kind of shape. The Burchen dunes, or the advancement of Burchen dunes, becomes very makes life very difficult to the people living in desert areas, because many times we have seen Burchen dunes encroaches upon the vegetation region of the desert, or say many times even the oasis region of desert are completely filled up by the Burchen dunes, and thus we have the deficiency or lack of water in the desert region. That is the first kind of dune, Burchen dunes. The second kind of dune that develops in a desert area is what we can call as longitudinal dune, which many times are also called as safe dune. So safe dunes have three major characteristics. First of all, they are very narrow in nature. In other term, you can define the safe dunes are very long, hundreds and hundreds of kilometers of length, narrow ridges of sand, often over 100 miles long. And the actual photograph of the safe dune you can clearly see here. Second characteristic of safe dunes, that they develop parallel to the prevailing wind. That means the dune development is in the same direction as in which the wind is blowing, and that is what makes it different from the birch and dunes, because in birch and dunes we have the transverse movement of dune, here we have the parallel movement of the dunes as compared to wind. And third characteristic is the amount of sand that makes up this safe dune or longitudinal dunes are much more lesser, or we can say we have moderate supply of sand as compared to birch and dunes, where we have huge supply of the sand and other kind of sediments. So this is what leads to development of the longitudinal or safe dune. So basically we try to understand how these dunes are developing. So what happens is that in this area where the wind is flowing through, this area, due to the flow of the wind or high velocity of wind, these sediments of this area, the silts of these areas are completely swept off, and thus we have a kind of shiny polished kind of surface, sediment free kind of surface that develops here. But many times some part of wind, when it develops into eddy current, when it start to rotate around this area, rotate around these valleys, then these wind that is moving in the form of eddy current, moving in transverse direction to the main direction of wind, they do not have so much power, they do not have so much velocity, and thus whatever the sediments or silts they are carrying, they start to deposit on both sides of this valley like a structure. And due to continuous accumulation of sediment by these eddy winds, you have development of a small ridge of sediment, which over a long period of time lead to development of a mound like shape of huge volume of sediment all across the region where you have the flow of wind that is happening. So this is how we have development of longitudinal dune or safe dunes. The third type of dune, which is very unique in its appearance, is what we can call as a star dunes. By the name itself, it's clear. We call it a star dune because it takes a kind of star-like shape. So these are very complex dunes because these develop in such area where wind velocity is not same all the time, but it changes very rapidly. Sometimes the wind is northeasterly, sometimes the wind is southwesterly. So due to continuous shift in the wind direction, rather than development of a single uniform kind of sand dunes, we have a complex kind of sand dune that develops. And thus, as we know, the star structure like that, you have a star dunes develop in such area where you have this kind of upward regions is there, and from there it seems like a lot of branches are radiating out, so radiating points. Second, we can see the star dunes can reach a very higher height up to 90 meters and extend outward for over twice their height. That means if their height is 90 meters, their overall extension can be up to 180 to 200 meters. And third point that makes a star dune different from birch and dunes is that they can remain stationary for centuries. We are not talking about years, but for centuries these star dunes can remain stationary, and thus they serve as a landmark for desert nomads. This is very important point, because birchen dunes, longitudinal dunes, this cannot serve as a landmark. as they're continuously moving. So maybe a person that is traveling in desert area today, he might see a particular we can say particular birchens at a particular location A today, but after 1 year that particular birchen might have moved to 100 or 200 300 meters away from that particular point. So that is why this star dunes play a very important role in serving as a landmark. So this is another important dune that we call as star dunes. The fourth and last type of sand dunes that we see mainly developing in the East Asia and especially in the China and Mongolia region is what we can call as loess. The word loess, however, has been derived from the French word where we have development of such kind of landform in the Alsace region of the France. So loess in simple term can be defined as regionally extensive accumulations of wind-blown silt. For thousands and thousands of square kilometer, we have an area that is completely covered by the silt that has been brought by the wind from some desert regions. And thus, they are a result of thousands of dust storms that takes place on an annual basis in a particular region of the world. And obviously, as you know, that if the wind is moving from this area having huge volume of sand silt, then they will carry the coarser particle to a shorter distance, but a finer segment, finer particles will be carried to a much longer distance. And thus, the one of the most important characteristic of alloys is that their thickness as well as the grain size decreases as their distance from their source increases. That is because the carrying capacity of the wind is higher near the source and is lower away from the source. And last important point what we can talk about today is it is made up of generally yellow silt. These are friable materials and usually very fertile in nature because they have large concentration of limestone rocks are there. There is large concentration of sodium and the phosphate minerals are there, and that is why this is also chosen as one of the most important agricultural landmarks of the world. To give you an idea about lowest deposits, there are some of the notable lowest deposits that we see across the world. But the most notable one is present in the China, basically the eastern coast of China, around the bank of Huanghe River. And these lowest deposit that has developed in China is because of the wind that has carried these silt particles, yellow sand particles from the Gobi and Taklamakan desert of the Central Asia and the Western China. And thus we have lowest deposits that have developed over thousands and thousands of years of time. Now, these are the landforms mainly we have discussed. The sand dunes are there that develop due to the movement of wind in desert area. But we know that in some part of desert, we have occasional rainfall that also happens. Sometimes you also have flash floods that happen. And thus sometimes streams or rivers, ephemeral rivers or streams develop in the desert areas. And due to the flow of this water, we have developments of some of the notable depositional features in the desert areas as well. For example, first of all, we have playas. Playas are also called as salars, or also many times it is called as salinas because it is a kind of saline body. So playas can simply be defined as low areas in the desert. Low area means, as you can see from this particular picture, everywhere around this desert area have this kind of mountainous or hilly kind of structure, and then playas develop in these low areas of desert, that is kind of plain area of desert, especially after intense precipitation, especially there is intense rainfall that has happened for a short period of time in desert, that helps in or that facilitates in development of playas. Playas are basically a shallow and often saline and short-lived water body, or we can say it is a short-lived lake, a temporary lake that develops due to the intense precipitation, localized intense precipitation. And playas, since they have huge amount of salt particles, they are filled up with mud cracks and salt deposits. And many times, many playas of the world are also used for for collection of salt or mining of the salt, because every time when rainfall happens, huge volume of salts are being or huge volume of salts are there that get dissolved in water, moves from these hilly areas and get collected here. But when the temperature again becomes higher, the water evaporates back, leaving all the salt behind in this crust of the desert. And that is when over long period of time, the continuous accumulation of this salt, we have this thick salt deposit that develop in the playa regions. So that is the first important landform that we can call as playas. There are a lot of playas you will see that develops in the western part of Aravallis, western slope of Aravallis in the Rajasthan region, because this is also arid area, but we have a lot of rivers and seasonal streams that develop in the monsoon season, and thus playa lakes develop in those regions also. The second most important deposition landform formed due to flow of water is what we can call as bahadas. Now, bahadas are something that is very, very similar to landform we have discussed in fluvial deposition landform, that is alluvial fan. So, in simple terms, same thing happens here as well. As you can see from the nearby hilly areas, due to flow of water, large volume, thick volume of sediments are brought by this water. But as they enter into the plain area, as they reach the foothills of this mountain or hill, their carrying capacity or sediment carrying capacity decreases, because now the slope is decreasing, slope has decreased a lot, and thus the flow volume water decreases, and thus all these sediments cannot be carried forward by water anymore. They are deposited near this foothill region, this slope of the hill regions, and thus we can say bahadas are alluvial sediment deposition. And then we have development of alluvial fans. Lot of alluvial fans develop here, and over a period of time these alluvial fans keep on merging with each other, they keep on coalescing with each other, and thus coalescence of numerous alluvial fans give rise to development of bahadas. Also, what we can say about bahadas, these are very common in such areas which are arid, desert in nature, but sometimes they are also suffering from flash flood, or flash flood occurrence are common in these regions, because when flash flood happens, huge amount of sediments are suddenly discharged toward the foothill regions. They get collected, accumulated, and then coalesce to form bahadas. So overall, to give you an overview of the landforms, how does it look like? This is suppose your desert areas, and they are surrounded by a large number of hills and mountain kind of terrain is there. So we have development of bahadas. That means you can see the river will bring, or the water stream will bring sediment from here. They will keep on accumulating in here, and all across this area you can see these alluvial fans that have developed will keep on merging and coalescing, leading to development of bahadas. Here you can see that in the plain areas, when the water is coming from all the sides, especially during the season of rainfall or intense rainfall that has happened for a short period of time, you have collection of water that happens in these plain areas, which later on evaporates due to high temperature, leaving behind the salt encrusted in this particular part of land. And then you have sometimes when the water is filled up in this playa, it is also called as playa lake. Then we have alluvial fans that we have discussed already in the fluvial landforms. If you have not seen that video, please you can refer to that video on YouTube. Then we have fault, and these are the pediments. Pediments are basically example of eroded landform, many times due to continuous movement of the wind and water just near the foothill of the mountains or hills in the desert areas. These pediments are kind of landform that develop due to a kind of smooth and polished surface that develops, which can be called as pediment. So this is all about the important depositional landforms that develops in a desert area due to the movement of wind as well as water. If you like the video, please hit the like button, share it with your fellow aspirants, as well as subscribe to our channel for more such helpful content. Thank you very much.